The midday sun hung heavy over Miami, turning every pavement into a slow-cooking griddle. Carlos adjusted his tie, though it was more for habit than comfort. The city was alive with chatter in English and Spanish, palm trees swaying lazily as if mocking everyone rushing to their next appointment. Inside the municipal building on Flagler Street, the air was cool but thick with tension. Carlos had been working here for just over a year, quietly filing reports and processing citizen complaints. He had heard stories about his boss, Mr. Rodriguez, a man who held his position for nearly 2 decades, but never once had to explain how his policies actually worked. That morning, the department had gathered for an emergency meeting. Rumors were already circling the office like vultures. Carlos took his seat at the long oval table, the hum of the fluorescent lights mixing with the faint sound of traffic outside. Mr. Rodriguez entered without greeting anyone, a stack of papers under his arm. He cleared his throat and announced a new city directive. From the following Monday, certain streets would be closed at random hours for what he called traffic flow improvement tests. Carlos raised an eyebrow, waiting for an explanation, but none came. One of the senior clerks, Mrs. Alvarez, spoke up. Her voice was calm, but her brow furrowed. She asked how drivers would know when streets were closed. Mr. Rodriguez smiled faintly, as if enjoying a private joke, and replied that drivers would simply need to be adaptable. Carlos felt a slow, creeping disbelief. The words adaptable echoed in his mind. In a city where a single road closure could turn a 10-minute trip into a 45-minute crawl, adaptability was just another word for chaos. He glanced at Lucia, his closest friend in the office, who met his eyes with a look that said, "Are you hearing this too?" After the meeting, Carlos lingered by the window, watching the endless stream of cars below. He could already imagine the honking, the frustration, the tourist buses trapped in narrow side streets. A hot breeze slipped through the barely closed pane, carrying the faint scent of sea salt and exhaust fumes. Something inside him shifted that day. It was not just about bad planning. It was about power in the hands of someone who had no intention of thinking things through. And as the shadows lengthened over Biscayne Bay, Carlos realized this was only the beginning. By the following Monday morning, the streets of Miami were restless. The usual rhythm of rush hour had been broken. Cones appeared without warning. Police waved drivers away from certain turns, sending them into narrow lanes not built for heavy traffic. The sound of horns and shouted curses echoed off the pastel-colored facades of Little Havana. Carlos stood at the bus stop, watching as 3 different cars tried to reverse out of the same one-way street. A man on a bicycle wove between bumpers with the grace of someone used to near misses. The smell of fresh cafecito drifted from a nearby ventanita, almost masking the fumes. Almost. At the office, the atmosphere was tense but strangely expectant. Staff whispered in corners, recounting the madness they had seen on their way in. Lucia arrived late, her hair windswept, eyes sharp. She slid into her chair and muttered that a delivery truck had been stuck under the I-95 overpass for nearly half an hour because the new diversions had led it there. When Mr. Rodriguez arrived, he was grinning. He called the situation a healthy test of civic flexibility. His voice carried the weight of someone who believed the chaos was proof of his genius. Carlos sat silently, tapping a pen against his notepad. Every tap matched the growing pulse of irritation in his chest. Mid-morning, a phone call came through from a furious shop owner on Calle Ocho. She claimed her customers could not reach her shop and that a police officer had told her to walk her deliveries across the cordon street herself. Carlos listened carefully, jotting down her complaint. The words tumbled out fast, charged with frustration. Later, over lunch, Carlos and Lucia sat at a cafe terrace overlooking a corner now barricaded with bright orange barriers. Tourists stood bewildered with maps in hand, spinning in circles to find another route. The clinking of coffee cups was underscored by the impatient blare of a taxi horn. Lucia leaned in and said quietly, "This isn't just poor planning. It's like he's doing this on purpose." Carlos didn't answer. Instead, he watched the reflection of the street in the cafe window. It was distorted, fractured into pieces by the glass. Just like the city. He knew they had seen only the first signs of what was to come. The municipal building took on a strange energy in the days that followed. The chatter was no longer about birthdays or weekend plans, but about the latest disruption on the streets. Clerks passed each other in corridors with hushed voices, as if discussing a secret storm rolling in from the Atlantic. Carlos noticed the pattern. Every morning, new closures appeared, never announced, always inconvenient. Side streets, essential bus routes, even the stretch outside the hospital. The chaos had no clear logic, and yet Mr. Rodriguez insisted the plan was unfolding exactly as intended. Lucia was more restless than usual. She leaned against Carlos's desk one afternoon, scanning the office to make sure no one was listening. She told him she had overheard Rodriguez speaking to a man in a suit she didn't recognize. The man had handed him an envelope, and the conversation ended with a handshake that felt far too friendly for a casual meeting. Carlos tried to dismiss it, but the image stuck in his mind. He began noticing how often Mr. Rodriguez disappeared during the day. How certain calls were taken behind closed doors. How, whenever he emerged, the smirk on his face was sharper than before. That Friday evening, as most staff had already left, Carlos stayed behind to finish reports. The building was quiet, the hum of the air conditioning loud in the emptiness. Passing by Rodriguez's office, he heard muffled laughter. He paused. Through the frosted glass, a shadow moved, gesturing wildly, as though celebrating a private victory. Carlos didn't know why, but he felt a knot tightening in his stomach. The following Monday began with an email marked urgent, summoning all department heads and senior staff to a meeting at 9. Carlos wasn't invited, but his desk was close enough to the conference room to hear the low drone of voices when the meeting began. By 10, the door opened and people filed out, their expressions tense. Lucia returned to her desk, face pale. She told Carlos that the meeting had been about a new proposal, a plan to extend the street closures for another 6 months, covering even more of the city. Rodriguez claimed the test was already showing positive results, though no one had seen any data. The most disturbing part, Lucia said, was the absence of anyone from the transportation department. Not one engineer, planner, or traffic analyst had been consulted. Later that day, Carlos walked past the lobby and saw Rodriguez speaking to the same unknown man in a suit. This time, the man was holding a folder. When he noticed Carlos, he smiled politely, but his eyes were calculating. That night, lying in bed, Carlos kept replaying the moment. The man's shoes had been spotless, the sort you didn't wear if you spent your day walking Miami streets. They were the shoes of someone who didn't get their hands dirty, but might pay others to do it for them. By midweek, tempers across Miami were fraying. Social media was full of videos showing gridlocked streets, arguments between drivers, even a near brawl outside a petrol station. The city's patience was evaporating in the humid air. Lucia decided they couldn't just sit by. She suggested confronting Rodriguez directly, not with accusations, but with questions he couldn't dodge. Carlos agreed, though part of him doubted it would make any difference. They found him in the break room, stirring sugar into his coffee. His smile was polite but cold as Carlos asked whether the closures were based on any official studies. Rodriguez took a slow sip, then replied that innovation didn't always need to wait for studies. Lucia pressed further, asking who had approved such an extended trial without public consultation. Rodriguez's eyes narrowed. He told them they were free to share their concerns, but warned them to choose their words carefully if they valued their positions. The conversation ended there, but the warning lingered like a bad taste. That evening, Carlos received a message from an unknown number. It contained only an address and the words, "You didn't hear this from me." The address was a small storage unit near the port. Curiosity gnawed at him. The next day, during his lunch break, he drove there. The air smelled of salt water and diesel from the docked ships. The unit's door was half open, and inside were stacks of metal signs, road closure notices identical to the ones all over the city. But these signs were branded with the name of a private construction firm Carlos had never heard of. A man emerged from the shadows inside the unit and asked if he was lost. Carlos muttered an excuse and left quickly, his heart pounding. As he drove away, he realized something If a private company was supplying the signs, and if Rodriguez was connected to them, the street chaos might be less about traffic experiments and more about money changing hands. The next week, an ambulance was delayed on its way to an emergency because of an unmarked closure. The patient, an elderly woman, arrived at the hospital too late. The story made the local news, sparking outrage. Rodriguez brushed it off, calling it an unfortunate coincidence. But Carlos could see the cracks forming. People in the office were speaking more openly now, no longer afraid to criticize him. Lucia suggested gathering evidence, emails, contracts, anything that connected Rodriguez to the construction firm. Carlos knew it was risky. If they were caught, it could mean their jobs, or worse. But he also knew they were past the point of staying quiet. For the next 2 weeks, Carlos and Lucia worked in the shadows. They stayed late under the pretense of catching up on paperwork, but in reality, they were combing through old files and archived meeting notes. One night, they found it, a payment authorization signed by Rodriguez for a series of contracts with a private firm. The amounts were excessive, far beyond the cost of temporary road signs. Even stranger, the contracts had been backdated. They made copies and stored them at Lucia's flat. But the deeper they dug, the more they realized how many people might be involved. Other signatures appeared on the documents, names from departments they thought were unconnected. Carlos began noticing a car parked near his building each night when he went home. Always the same model, always the same dent on the left bumper. He told himself it was nothing, but his gut said otherwise. At work, Rodriguez seemed more irritable. His door was shut more often, and his conversations with the man in the suit were shorter, sharper. Then one morning, Carlos arrived to find his desk drawers had been rifled through. Nothing was missing, but the message was clear. Someone knew they were looking. A week later, the city was on the brink. The closures had spread so far that delivery lorries were backed up for miles, and protests were forming outside the municipal building. Carlos and Lucia decided they had enough evidence to go public. They planned to meet a journalist at a quiet cafe near South Beach, one who had been covering the traffic chaos since the beginning. The night before the meeting, Carlos stood on his balcony, staring out at the city lights. The sound of distant sirens drifted on the warm wind. He felt the weight of what they were about to do. Down on the street, the dented car was parked again. This time, its engine was running. The storm was coming, and they were standing right in its path.